In this interview, I'm joined by Michael Taft, maverick meditation teacher, best-selling author, host of the Deconstructing Yourself podcast, and founder of the Alembic meditation community. Michael recounts his lifelong meditation journey, his initial reluctance to teach meditation, the writing of the Mindful Geek, and his divergence from Shinzen Young. Michael reveals his troubled upbringing, crippling teenage anxiety, and intense experimentation with LSD and the occult. Michael also shares a transformative mystical experience in Japan, describes his practice of classical Hindu tantra, and details experiences of seeing other dimensional entities in daily life. So without further ado, Michael Taft. Michael Taft, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Or should I call you Guru?
Yes, Steve's fine. I've been called worse. I've been called worse than both, I can assure you.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so great to be talking to you today, Michael. I'm super excited about this, and I'm sure there won't be a listener among my listeners or viewers that's not aware of who you are. Your podcast, Deconstructing Yourself. Fabulous podcast. I think one of the most famous and widely listened to podcasts in the field. Really amazing. So I'm excited to put you on the other side of the thing.
I'm excited to be on the other side. It's fun to do both parts of the system.
Mm-hmm. And of course, everyone I think will also know, perhaps if they don't, then they'll soon find out, that Michael's also a very highly regarded meditation teacher, working, from what I understand, mainly one-on-one, but also groups in group context also. So we're going to learn about that. And an interesting life too. You know, I was rereading your book, Mindful Geek, which you published in 2015, 7 years ago. That's a good amount of time to look back on a book. Now, I'm wondering, when you reflect on that, what were you trying to accomplish with that book, both in terms of yourself as a teacher and who it was for? And when you look back at it 7 years later, how do you see it now? Have your views changed since then in any way? Would you write it differently today? Or I'm just curious if you might reflect on that book. It was very popular, of course, Mindful Geek.
Yeah, that was a fun book to write. I spent basically 3 months in local coffee shops, back when you could go to coffee shops, and just writing away and doing tons of research. And I was working with several neuroscience researchers who were checking all the facts, and it was great. I enjoyed writing that. And to answer your question, the view or vision of why or for whom I was writing that book was very specific. I had been, as you know, Steve, I'm sure, a student of Shinzen Young for many, many years. And Shinzen had authorized me to teach long ago, like almost at this point going on 20 years ago. And for a long time, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to teach because I had been in a very serious guru tradition for a really long time. And so to me, it was, I don't know, presumptuous to, take the role of the teacher or whatever. But then a large number of people where I was living in LA at the time were requesting that I teach them. They wanted to learn meditation and they just needed someone to show them how. And after a while, it felt like refusing because to show them how to meditate was much more presumptuous than just going ahead and doing it. It just seemed ridiculous after a while to keep refusing. So I started teaching them, and which was great. It was a fabulous group. That was actually a 12-step group. And so even though I was not myself in 12-step, I started teaching quite a large, really fun Los Angeles 12-step group. It was a wonderful Sangha, and several of those people have gone on to become teachers themselves. But anyway, when I started working with them, the thing that seemed most salient and most applicable to their situation, and that I felt the most confident in showing them how to do was the Shinzen style material. And I was sticking pretty close to what I would call Pukka Shinzen teaching, right? So pure, clean, orthodox, so to speak, in quotes, with a smiley face on it, Shinzen material. And so I got really comfortable teaching that to groups and in public, and I started doing that also at companies and corporations and so on. And even though my own experience is, coming originally from a very different place and includes a lot of other different kind of stuff, I thought, well, this sort of sliver of how mindfulness can be delivered in a totally secular context to people who are, fully engaged in life, not trying to be meditators or necessarily on a spiritual search, but they want to gain these benefits. This way of teaching really talks to them, and they actually were reported getting a lot out of it. And also, as I say, some people then did go on to engage in quite a deep and serious spiritual search of those people I was teaching. So it seemed like basically this particular view of teaching and way of communicating and sort of like package of materials fit together really nicely in something that I would call, geeky mindfulness, or, kind of a secular mindfulness. And so that, because I had spent so much time kind of working with those teachings in that way, it really made sense to put it in a book. And so it's one particular sliver of material that, as a teacher, you develop your material more and more. You iterate, and you see what lands with people and what doesn't land with people, and how to frame it and all that. So all that material had been so worked for so many years that it was relatively, writing a book is never easy, but compared to some, that was relatively easy and actually kind of fun to put out. On the other hand, again, to answer the other part of your question, it's certainly just a sliver of how I think about things and how I might talk about things depending on, who's listening or what we're talking about. So it's intended for a very specific audience. And as I say in the introduction to the book, it's not like this is anti-religion or something. It's just aimed at people who, like, for example, if I would go and teach at Google, which I've done a bunch, especially back then, if I even said the word Buddha or something, like a quarter of the room would get up and leave, like just at the mention of religion, And so I was like this, I'm not in any way against, obviously, any of the religion or spiritual teachings in their spiritual context, but there's a lot of people who will never, ever, ever listen to it in that format. They just won't. And so I wanted that book to be entirely outside of that context. So it's got its own little niche, and that's been a fun, multi-decade exploration.
Oh, very interesting. Would you say that the sort of approach outlined in Mindful Geek represents how you'd work with that particular slice of the population if you were going into Google or so? Would it look a lot like that, or have you also evolved that particular slice of your material?
It would look a lot, it would be recognizably that material, but I also have done so much more work with companies and corporations, and now instead of LA, I'm in, I've been in the Bay Area for over 10 years, so lots and lots and lots of tech corporations. So it has changed to some extent. Yeah, it's a little less Pukka Shinzen, unified mindfulness, and that has gone off in its own direction, and I've kind of veered slightly in a different direction, even though, again, they the two languages could speak to each other without too much trouble. But it's evolved since then for sure.
Yeah, I get that sense from you and from your output that there is this iteration process, this evolving process. And in your bio, you describe yourself. The first adjective is maverick meditation teacher.
Yeah.
So it's Michael Taft. Michael Taft is a maverick, is the first thing. So that definitely speaks to that. I want to circle back to your biography and these things. But now, while we're on the subject, could you talk a little bit about that divergence?
Which divergence?
The divergence you pointed to from, say, unified mindfulness, the current name of Shinzen's system, for example, and the ways in which you're going from Paka Shinzen, as you put it, to this divergence. Could you identify some of the key, I suppose, differences there and what's behind them?
Oh, it's basically that Shinzen iterates as well. And, he encourages iteration. He encourages me to iterate. So since we're both iterating independently, things, just different areas of interest come up. We're working with different populations sometimes and so on. So, we kind of emphasize different points and go in different directions. I've certainly taken my material in a, much more strongly in a non-dual direction, in quotes, but a non-dual direction. And even though Shinzen includes all that and talks about that even more recently than he did, that's not usually considered like where his stuff starts. And for a long time now, I've been starting there. So again, even though it's interoperable, we just kind of pursued our separate angels of inspiration in mildly different directions. Again, we talk a lot. It's not like there's some kind of communication gap there. There's just different stuff we're into.
Very interesting. Yeah, perhaps we'll talk later about how one starts with the non-dual. Of course, depending on who you listen to, non-dual sometimes seen as the end, right, to the highest.
Sure.
To start there is very interesting indeed. I don't know if we should talk about that now or later. I'm thinking later.
Whatever you'd like, Steve. I'm at your service.
You don't have to make those decisions today.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, let's go back to your biography then.
Surely the most fascinating part of this program.
Well, I'm very fascinated actually by your life. You've had a remarkably interesting life, and you said of your childhood, there were some people in my family that were going through some very serious mental health issues when I was a very small child, and that affected me in some pretty predictable and extremely unpleasant ways.
So that it was true, but.
So that by the time I was in high school, I was experiencing immobilizing anxiety attacks all the time. So I'm wondering if you could say a little about your childhood, your upbringing in that context. I think it's very interesting and relevant, and you've used it in this way actually to frame how you and why you got into meditation and what it was you got out of meditation. So I've heard you frame your childhood. You're asking, where did you say that? You framed your childhood in that way before as part of the arc of your own, this is what I got out of meditation sort of angle. So I'm curious about your childhood. What was the context?
Yeah, so it's interesting if you're doing like traditional Hindu stuff, they sometimes talk about the various reasons that someone would get involved in spirituality. And I'm gonna mess up the list, but some of them are, for example, desire for the truth. Okay, yeah, you just want to know the truth, a pure desire for that. Another one is a kind of naturally open devotional heart where you just feel tremendous devotion towards God. And there's a few others, but one of them is just because you're in pain. And they always say, and that's the most common, by far. There's not so many people born with like this tremendous devotion or this burning desire for truth, but lots of people are in pain. So I'm one of those initially, just suffering a lot. And, childhood was a completely, from the outside, completely normal Midwest American, family situation, like a mom and a dad and a bunch of kids, and everyone is well employed and doing their jobs and all that. But when I was very young, like a year old, my mother's best friend was killed by a drunk driver. So sudden, really tragic accident. The friend was pregnant at the time. I mean, it's just horrible, horrible event. And for many, many reasons, having to do with grief and lack of support and all kinds of stuff, my mom entered a 10-year serious depression and with tremendous difficulty. And the rest of the family tried to cope with that and wasn't doing too well. And so I'm, one when this starts. And so there's no blame on anybody in this situation, except for maybe the drunk driver. But even he was a World War II vet who probably was traumatized out of his mind. He survived the accident. So there's no blame there, but it really made my earliest childhood a scene of a lot of really obviously painful, difficult, terrifying, upsetting stuff all the time. And a real lack of support. Like sometimes in my bios, you'll see, I'll say like, I was raised by wolves. And because I felt like my chief support there was the family dog, who I got along with tremendously well. And, spent a lot of time together with her. And my brothers and sisters were wonderful and helped me as much as they could for being other little children, also going through the same difficult situation. So it was just a mess and nobody's fault. But coming out of that into puberty and so on, I was not well equipped to smoothly handle, high school and so on. It was just rough. And so spent a lot of time attempting to figure out how to just deal with what was going on internally. And like you mentioned, I was having really bad anxiety attacks, which if you never had the kind where you just can't even move, then like literally you're so stuck you can't stand up kind of thing, then maybe you don't know what I'm talking about, listeners, but if you've had that kind, then you know what I'm talking about. It's an extreme level of anxiety. And so I'm using immobilizing in a literal sense. And so eventually, my mom's a librarian. I was taught to read almost before I could walk. And so I remember organizing her card catalog is one of the first thing I learned to do. So alphabetize a card catalog, practically in diapers, not literally, but really, really early on. And so I was just reading and reading and reading and really interested in everything. And back then you could get, you still can, but back then there wasn't actually a lot of meditation literature available at all, especially kind of like popularly and available. But this is the 70s, so there were magic books. And so like from Llewellyn, the publisher's still around, right? You could get, astral travel book or whatever. And it was probably in an astral travel book or something where they were talking about how to do yoga nidra. They didn't call it that, but how to do a progressive relaxation meditation before you did your astral travel. And so I started doing progressive relaxation meditation and couldn't believe, how positive and powerful and helpful the effects were, and what a relief it was to be able to, on purpose, calm down, basically, regulate my own anxiety And quickly, I kind of extrapolated from there on my own without the book and understood, like, had some insights into how thinking about anything more than 24 hours away made it a lot worse. So I dialed back my thinking into the present moment, and et cetera, and really got a handle on the anxiety. And from there, though, was hooked, right? Once you find pain relief, wow, this really works. It's not kidding around. I'm not imagining that I feel much better. I really do feel much better. So I got very involved in meditation in a bunch of different traditions from there.
Yeah, it's very fascinating indeed. Did you find that meditation practice, I don't know if the word would be cured the anxiety, in the sense that it made the arising of anxiety either go away or less common, or did you find a way of effectively dealing?
It's more of a palliative, yeah. At least when it arose, I could, between that meditation and kind of like thought hygiene, I could really keep myself much more relaxed and down-regulate once it was upregulated. Took a lot longer to figure out how to, really cure the anxiety. That's a larger kettle of fish, but it did eventually happen. But I'll tell you, even the palliative version was a miracle for me at the time.
You mentioned there reading books published by Llewellyn, magic books, astral travel and so on. Were you quite heavily into that stuff? Did you experiment with things like astral travel, lucid dreaming, I guess, the sorts of things that those sorts of books propagate? Were you practically trying that as well as the Yoga Nidra?
Oh, of course, all of it. And for years, so even when you get into hardcore Vajrayana or Hindu Tantra practices, you're doing just a super high level version of some of the same stuff. So so I definitely have done quite a bit of that sort of thing at some point or another. Lots of Aleister Crowley, lots of, this is before anybody was really into that stuff. Now it's like, you could find giant programs online that teach you, but yeah, so Western mysticism also.
Okay, that's very interesting. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, talk about whatever you want, man.
Okay. Okay, that's very cool. So can we trace that a little bit? So you're reading these books and you're, I guess, learning about all these things just via whichever books you're picking up in that way that teenagers do, and trying out the techniques. You hit upon Yoga Nidra, amazing results from that. And that laid a certain breadcrumb trail, I guess, for your meditation later on. What about the magical side of things, astral travel? Did you do ritual magic and so on? Can you give us a bit of a genealogy or lineage of your explorations in that particular domain?
It's too chaotic to call it a genealogy or anything like that. But just imagine reading everything and trying everything. So I've done all that stuff. Got very seriously into tarot. We're talking, I'm like 17 or 18 or whatever, very, very into it. Into ritual magic, into Wicca, into shamanism. We're talking the early 80s here. So it was in the drinking water at that point. And but again, hardly any materials available compared to now. And at a certain point, my roommate, because by that time I was in college. I was in college when I was 17, I think, And a roommate of mine gave me a book by Robert Anton Wilson called Cosmic Trigger. And that book lived up to its title in my life. So I read that book and I was cosmically triggered. It just opened me up to everything. It's the kind of book that attempts on purpose to keep showing the frame, the kind of frame you're putting around experience, and shows you the frame and then breaks the frame, and then shows you another frame and then breaks the frame, and does it over and over. Try out this reality tunnel, as Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary call it. Try out that reality tunnel And it's not doing it, it's doing it very much on purpose, but it's not being exactly explicit about it. But the effect on me was exactly what it's supposed to be, which is kind of like acted like a print version of a psychedelic. I mean, it just opened my mind tremendously. But it also opened my mind. The same roommate gave me a bunch of acid. And so my mind was open in another way at that point. And that things really drastically took off at that then.
You've described that time as a time where you took daily large dose LSD for years. And then you also said massive amounts for a long time.
Yes.
So I'd like to ask you about that. Is that in conjunction really with this, if we could say, magical operations that you were engaging in?
Kind of, but by that point, I had learned something that the chaos magicians learned maybe at the same time or a little later, but I learned it independently. There was no such thing as chaos magic when I was doing this. And that was, I would read all these books and they had all their systems, and I realized that the systems, none of them matched, right? They were all completely different than each other. And so if they were purporting to somehow be a system for working with, the underlying structure of reality, it was odd that none of them worked in the same way. And so very early on, this did not take a long time to get to. I was like, oh, people are just making these systems up. So there's two things possible. I can make up my own system. I mean, I could go with someone else's, but why do that? I'll make up my own. Or, and that's the chaos magic direction, right? Make up your own system. Or that's why they call it chaos. Or, and this was an interesting thought. I'm like, maybe it's because all the lineages of this are broken in the West. Are there any lineages anywhere that aren't broken? And that question ended up getting me over a long period of time later, but ended up getting me involved with Indian, Indo-Tibetan Tantrism. Because guess what? The lineages aren't broken, they're unbroken. And so there's a different kind of relationship to the material and availability of the material, and a little bit more of a congruence in the material. So it felt like going from our, kind of reclaiming our own shattered lineages to something that was still a living tradition, still had its solid roots in the past that had never been severed. And so that was very attractive.
I'm wondering, such a formative time. I'm wondering what other, I suppose, if you could extract any more essence from that time, things you learned or ways in which that period influenced your view.
I could take this back to the Robert Anton Wilson book, but maybe it's just me, but it's always from that time and since then, you will find that I never am able to land on any particular worldview. And it might just be characterological, maybe it's some kind of character flaw, but try as I might, sometimes I can't find any particular conceptual worldview or map of how the universe works that seems to me final or correct. And so from this very early period, again, we're talking the early 80s, I just sort of allergic to or immune to really planting myself in any particular worldview. Rather, I'm very happy to take new ones on and really work with them and dive in and do fun stuff and understand it from the inside and all that. But eventually, its contradictions will start being really apparent, and the places that it's obfuscating or not working become apparent, or the ways that it um, whole areas that it's not serving become apparent. And then, and that's at this point, that's not like some kind of big disappointment. It's just like, oh, okay, well, that's the limits of that, and then we'll try something else. But that way of understanding the world, or not understanding the world, however you want to put it, is fundamental, and that started then. And a real thing I used to say all the time back then, again, 18, 19, 20-year-old, as an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old, was, I'm trying to break the confines of conceptuality and try to break the system of thought that I'm in over and over again. And that seems to have stuck. Now, of course, people will immediately point out, well, that's its own system of thought or whatever. And it is when you state it like that, but living it is different. It's really interesting to, and I think fun and beautiful and empowering to have that kind of like place to stand, or that rug pulled out from under one over and over again, right? Which I think is a core feature of many forms of spirituality. Even when they are putting forth a kind of worldview, very often they'll then undercut that worldview on purpose. So I really appreciate that. And of course, the work of my good friend, David Chapman, on metasystematicity, talks to this in a really, high level, super brilliant philosophical way. So I really enjoy his work quite a bit, because he talks about that in a way that I only intuitively understand, but he's really got a whole, deep understanding of it.
Mm. Yeah, I've actually, more than one person has said to me, I read David Chapman's blog. I'm loving it. It's great. And then I hear from them again, and then they say, he's ruined everything for me.
Yes. Then he's doing a good job. It's he's a wonderful human being, and also a deep practitioner, and that blog will definitely challenge your assumptions and your worldview about everything. Again, it's just like it's like a much more precise and well-defined version of Cosmic Trigger, where we just keep breaking the frame and breaking the frame and breaking the frame. So that's been a real theme. There's several themes, but that's it's not something I'm ever trying to do. It just happens.
I wonder what if this is perhaps the wrong way to think of it, what the outcome of that way of working is. Is there a stated goal?
There's not a stated goal. Like I say, I'm not trying to do it. It just happens. But the outcome is that I'm much more about practice than about philosophy, even though I can, fairly decently talk about a lot of different philosophies, especially South Asian spiritual philosophies. It's not like I'm ignorant of that in a brutal way. I could talk about it. I've read a lot of books. I've talked to a lot of people, but fundamentally, that's not where the juice is, because that's just piles of concepts. The juice is in experience. The juice is in the practice. The juice is in life. And so that's the real, again, there's not a goal and there's not an outcome really. It's just almost, like I say, maybe it's just a character flaw, I don't know. But I keep doing that. It just happens. And then you're out of your conceptual box and back in the world. And that's always very joyous and beautiful, right? It's incredibly beautiful.
It's very interesting what you're saying. And as a teacher, you're well known as a teacher, and I think particularly well known for your one-on-one teaching work with meditators of various different levels. But I think a favorite group, or I don't know if it's your favorite, but a group that seems to, I think, drawn to you in particular are people who say, well, I've got a lot of experience with meditating. You write about this in Mindful Geek, actually. I've been meditating now for 5, 10, 15 years or so, and I had lots of insights and things went really well. But now nothing's happening. My practice is fine. It's solid. It looks good and so on, but it's become stagnant, or it's hit some sort of a plateau. It seems like this cosmic trigger it could be an interesting way of disrupting that. I'm wondering what other methods you use. But actually, what I was thinking was, when someone comes to you and they say, okay, Michael, I've read this book or I've seen this resource. I'd like to get, say, stream entry, the way this person defines it. Or, okay, I'd like to get non-dual awakening. I've been influenced by this and this teacher or so on, or, whatever's the case. Okay, I'm looking for, I want to get into Turiya, something like this, etc. People coming to you they'll have presumably often some sort of conceptual orientation aligned or influenced by, to some degree, mainline religious systems, and I guess also other maverick teachers of time. Do you?
I'm going to have to remove that word maverick from my bio.
Well, I took it to mean unlineaged in the sense of
that's correct. Yeah, that's how I'm using it.
That you're not anyway. You're not claiming lineage authorization from any particular source, right? Which is so often done.
Correct.
Yeah, I thought that was the point of the word. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a correct definitional use of it. I'd certainly say, and it sounds cool as well. But do you, I suppose, offer a particular method or route? Do you say, okay, we're going to get you enlightened in this way or that way? Or are you able to shapeshift when you're working with people into whatever their particular goals are, even if they're quite specific in terms of philosophy or meditation? Maybe a person in the morning you work with has got a really rather different, maybe even oppositional view to the person in the afternoon. When you work with people, do you shapeshift like that, or do you say, I have achieved or attained this, and I can guide you towards what I know? How do you play it?
I shapeshift, basically. I mean, the number one question is, what did they want? Because I don't think there's one right thing that people are supposed to want. And so depending on what they want, I might be able to help them with that. And if I can't, I certainly can point them to someone who can. Very often, what people want is something that I would consider more psychologically accessible, or, they essentially think they're going to get something out of meditation that I think they can get in a different way, maybe more effectively. So I will point them in that direction. Also, if they are very, very, let's say, I want to use a positive term here, very enthusiastic about a particular tradition and exactly done in the traditional way, then I'll show them, who they can talk to, who will be like, this is the one right way, and this is how we do it, because that's what they want. And I think that's cool. Like, get into it. That's great. But for the people who, they do have particular goals, and I feel those goals are accessible through meditation, and they have the kind of, like, maybe they've tried several different lineages over many years, and they're a little open about working in different ways. Then I'll start working with them and ask a lot of questions to figure out what I think the inroad is, the most effective doorway will be, and then we start working there and just iterate. But for me, that's really, you said in the morning one, in the afternoon another. It's more like every hour a different one. People with very different worldviews and very different needs and different goals and different practice history and different context and oftentimes different cultures and languages and all that. And so if there's being good at meditation and there's being good at teaching anything, right? Those are two different skills. And in terms of the teaching department, I feel like I get a lot of feedback that I'm good at putting things in a way that the person will understand, like speaking someone's language. And that makes it really great for working one-on-one. That makes it a little harder to talk to a group where, all those different worldviews and different needs and different backgrounds and different practice histories and stuff need to all be addressed. I do that, of course, but it's interesting because it's a little more challenging. It means I have to, kind of put forth a system that everyone's working with, that I want them to work with. And so, I'm able to do that, and that's fun. And at least some people get a lot out of it. And at the same time, probably the most powerful work is one-on-one. And I think that's supported historically. I think most, teaching relationships are, a direct one-on-one or a very small group to the teacher. That's where, if there's anything to the concept of, transmission, and I don't even mean that spiritually, like I got a certain kind of transmission from my college German teacher, he just brought a certain kind of brilliance to what he was teaching. And I just took every course he taught to just take that in. So in other words, I don't mean some kind of magical transmission. I just mean literally kind of getting inside the mind of what it's like to do that. That's done one-on-one, and that's teacher to student. And again, I think that's pretty traditional, really. So for being not a good traditionalist, I'm doing something that I think is pretty traditional, even though it's being done over a cell phone.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. You've emphasized the really massive amounts of LSD, big doses, and almost daily for a long time, years, in fact. And you've talked about some of the positive consequences of that, mind-opening consequences and so on, and insights that have come from that to some extent. Do you think, looking back, there were any negative consequences of taking that much LSD over such a sustained period of time?
No, not for me. I mean, for other people, for sure. Everyone has a different chemical makeup and psychological, system, and their brains are, everyone's brain is different. So it's not like I'm recommending it or saying it wouldn't be bad for another person, because I did see lots of people have bad experiences. So I would never say something like that as a general statement. Please don't hear me say that. But for me, it was just entirely positive, and I loved it. And probably the worst outcome is like some really bad sartorial expressions, some really stupid clothing and dumb outfits and so on. It's probably the worst you could say about it.
That's very funny indeed. So after that, you graduated, you moved to Japan to teach English.
I moved to Japan, yeah, and just get into just do something really different. And it just happened to be that in the mid-'80s in Japan, you could show up as a native speaker of English and get a job that paid very well by American depressed 1980s standards. And for someone like me who actually had a college degree in a language capacity, because my college degree is in German literature. So let's talk Kafka. It was easy to get good paying work and have a great time. It was a continuous wild party going on in Japan at that time.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And it was there that you had what you've described, I think, as one of, if not the most significant awakening experiences at age 24. Could you talk about that time?
The particular experience, or just being there?
Well, perhaps one could lead to the other.
Yeah. Okay, so it was really fun, and there's like a wonderful expat community at that time. A lot of the expats in Japan back then were people who had started traveling in the late 60s or early 70s around Asia, kind of, and ended up by the mid 80s in Japan, and they'd been gone the whole time. from England or Canada or the States or whatever, UK in one way or another, Australia. And so it's just an incredibly fun and interesting group of people. And I had been taking martial arts in America for many years with a really serious teacher in the Shorin-ryu Okinawan karate style. My teacher, Iha Sensei, was an Okinawan man who I really respected and learned from him for many years. And then, so part of what I took up in Japan was not the same, but a similar style of karate. And did that for several years there quite intensely. It was really, really, really fun, super intense training, and teaching English and wildly partying. Like back in college, especially during the LSD days, I did not drink. I just was anti-alcohol in every way, which is hilarious. It's, obviously I was doing this other chemical quite a bit, but I felt like, in the 1980s milieu at college, other people they're mainly drinking. There's people doing heroin and morphine. There's people, all that stuff. And all of that to me was just completely no way. That's just not anything I'm interested in. But psychedelics, yes, with capital letters. But none of that's available in Japan. And furthermore, it was just a different scene. And so in that society with those folks, it was kind of more of a bar situation, go out to the bar and talk and share stories and play music. And it was just fun, really, really fun. But one of my friends there that I met at the English school was a guy from University of Wisconsin at Madison, and he was really, really into Buddhism, and we had a lot to talk about. He was also into the beats and beat poetry and knew a lot about that, which I did too. I had read literally everything. And so how did this work? A friend of mine ended up sending me some bladder acid, which I had not touched any in a long time because it just wasn't available in Japan. And so me and this friend of mine in Japan one night decided we were going to do that. And what I didn't understand is that the bladder they had sent me was much more powerful than I expected a single one to be. That's why they sent it. They're like, Michael will like this. So it's like extra walloping. And there was something about probably a mixture of not having done it in a long time and being in Japan and being with someone of like mind and being out in the mountains all night with various, the woods and the trees and the mountains and the forests and watching the sunrise and all that. Anyway, it was quite an intense experience. And again, I'm saying intense from the viewpoint of someone who had done a lot of psychedelics. So let's just say really intense. And by the next day, I was a changed human being, and took me several months to even kind of settle back down, and actually more than a year before I was in basically a highly altered state, very, very altered state for about a year afterwards, very positive altered state, and with no chemical support for that whole year. It was just the results of that, and basically that was the major shift in life. Nothing has ever even remotely been the same since then. So, and even my dearest friends were like, you're a different person. What has become of you, in a positive sense? I mean, I was much happier and much more fun to be around, and a lot more loose and open and joyous all the time. And so it wasn't like a bad thing, but it was certainly very noticeable. And it's just never gone back.
Looking back at that now, is all the experience you've had, of course, across so many different traditions and ways of describing these sorts of things. How would you describe that now, if you had to sort of break it down or so? What did you experience? What could it be categorized or labeled as? And what were its consequences? Aside from, of course, loosening up, much more positive, much more happy. It seems there were perhaps more profound depths to it than that.
Yeah, I'm not going to put a particular label on it because you know, it's outside of tradition, and labels go with traditions and so on. But what I will say is that the experience itself, for most of it, was it started out really amazing, and then became hellish for many, many hours, extreme hellish. And I'd gone through that before sometimes, but this was at a different level of intensity. And eventually, at a certain point, when things were so bad for so long, for hours of like the worst experience you can imagine having, I just, and I'm not even going into the details here, it would take hours to really unpack it, but I had sort of a something that reminds me of like a chud practice or something. And it was just like, to put it in kind of mundane terms, like, okay, this is a living hell, and I think if I let go into this, I'm going to die, and maybe even worse than die, like be annihilated. And I resisted that, and then I said, okay, let's just be annihilated. And so I sat down, so like dawn, you know, on a mountain in Japan. I just sat down in a full lotus posture and settled in to meditate, and just said, okay, annihilate me. I'm ready. And it did. So that's the easiest way to describe it, but that's not the, you know, it's not a heaven realm kind of vision. It was definitely through the via negativa, dark side, hell realm version. Although at that point, coming back from the total annihilation, it did flip into kind of a ongoing vision that went on for a long time of being, you know, like a Pure Land kind of vision where everything's made of jewels and mantras and stuff. But anyway, the big moment was the just let it, okay, annihilation is good at this point, and letting go of that. And so what do I think happened there? Again, I don't want to put it into any particular framework, but certainly those issues around fear of death were resolved, and anything to do with a sense of, you know, who I am or the sense of self or all that was just utterly shattered in a way that has never reconstituted, like back into that smaller sense of self. And, you know, so stuff like that, that's the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of thing that went on there. Again, we'd have to really spend many hours to unpack it, and I never do that. People's trip reports are you know, largely personal, but the important stuff is, for me, what I found out is, you know, even surrendering into a really negative sense of total annihilation, if you really do it, you can't pretend. You gotta just say, okay, I'm ready, and fully give up. That can be the best thing that ever happened to you. It certainly was for me.
Wow, that's quite amazing. After that, can you say something about mantras and jewels, and I think you said, and stuff like that?
Well,
do
you
you
ever
mean
read
literally?
something like the Avamtaka? I'm not saying it right. Avamtaka. Gosh, what is the name of it? It's over here. Anyway, I'm messing up my Sanskrit. That's unforgivable. Avamtaka Sutra? No, that's not it. Somebody correct me. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. It's called the Jewel Ornament Sutra. And page after page of that sounds like a word for word of description of what I was literally seeing. So every object in the world is not an object. It's just, but it looks like it's made of jewels, and every sound is not a sound, it's a mantra that's being intoned, and I can actually see the mantras, and lots of that for a long time.
You saw the mantras in terms of their script, or in terms of sort of light or pulses of some sort? What was the visual experience of the mantras?
Sometimes it was script, sometimes it was every so-called object is just these unfolding onion skins of mantras that are reciting, or jewels, or both, that kind of thing. Iterating. So, and each person is just a sacred light, moving around, pretending to be a person, and even that sacred light is itself not that kind of vision.
When you saw the scripts, were they in the, so to say, writing alphabets of the source languages, or did you see them in English, or how did that work?
All of, of course, I'm aware of the source languages and so on, but it was a visionary experience. So if I try to put it into words, I would say it was all of them.
This is so fascinating. I have two more questions about it. Number one, when one thinks of heavenly realms and pure lands and so on,
I just want to interrupt and say, it's just an experience. So it's not like I look back at that and think, oh, that experience of a heaven realm is something, I'm going to hang on to. That's why you see me kind of going, it was this and that, because it's not like I look back at that and go, oh, that was the real world. It's just an experience. It was a cool experience. I'm glad I had it, but like kind of fetishizing the details for me is not the important part. It's like one can really just have those kind of experiences, and they're transformative. And what's important about it is the transformation.
Right, which was going to be my second of the two questions. So feel free to pass on the first one if it feels like.
Oh, it's okay. I mean, go for it.
Well, the first one was entities. So, of course, your perception of objects and of people transformed, it seems, from what you're saying. You're describing that. Were you also, did you also have experiences of, say, otherworldly entities or other dimensional entities, the sorts of things that are also reported in these sorts of mystical experiences, classically speaking?
Yes, but that was not new for me. So, that was very common. So that, yes, there was quite a bit of that, but that did not seem that unusual.
What's your experience then at that time and before with entities then? What sort of things were you seeing?
Just think of the panoply. So, is it a deity? Is it a bodhisattva? Is it an angel? Is it an elf? Is it some kind of Metatronic? Who knows? All that sort of stuff. Certainly had a lot of experience with that kind of thing, and not high. So whether that's, we could say, wow, he's really open to that stuff, or we could say, wow, he really was mentally ill as a child or whatever, even though, of course, I was never diagnosed with anything at all and seemed pretty normal to most people. However we want to frame that openness to, other realms and other beings has always been there. So, yeah, still there.
That's what I was going to say. It's still there. Has it changed at all over the decades?
Not really. I get, it's certainly normalized to the point where I don't. It's not a big deal. It's like, oh yeah, there's some stuff happening. That's cool. And it might be wonderful, but at the same time, I understand that that's pretty unusual and most people aren't having that experience. And I certainly wouldn't think that that's an important experience for other people. Like, I'm not training anyone to do that in any way. I wouldn't even know how. It's just my mind works that way.
Well, that's fascinating. Speaking of training, I recently interviewed Beth Upton, an English woman who was a nun for 10 years, actually, the first 5 of which she spent under quite close instruction of Pauk Sayadaw.
Yes.
She discussed in that interview, which is out now, actually, opening of the wisdom eye, that they had methods and techniques to open this wisdom eye, which is the means that they have of seeing these sorts of realms that evidently you were able to see quite naturally, entities and heaven realms and all this sort of things. It's quite interesting. Seems there are, of course, you're aware of that, but for the sake of conversation, bringing it up, it seems there are also methods to, if one's interested, to be able to perceive these realms.
Yeah, although do the methods work for most people? I don't know. They do work for some people. I suspect they work for people who are already kind of that way to begin with. But I'm not sure why you would want to. Of course, I'm aware of what all the answers to that question are, but for me, it's not like beings in other realms, whether they even exist or not, are any smarter than us or have more information than us, or it's to take kind of to just interject one Buddhist view. It's like, yeah, they're just living in those realms too, and they have their difficulties as well. So it's a lot of work to do those kind of practices, and you have to really spend a tremendous amount of time. And what do you really get out of it? Are you getting actual insight? Is it changing your life in a positive way? Are you better at loving your partner and your family and being with other people? Are you helping the world in any way that's better because of it? I don't know. I kind of doubt it. I think if it's there, it's interesting, and that kind of interacting with these beings as persons and all that is natural for me and fun and interesting. But to make that like an explicit goal and do heavy duty practices seems like kind of like spiritual tourism or something, even though I've done those heavy practices and all that. So I don't mean for other people. For me now, it seems like that. So I'm not criticizing another person doing it, but I would just be like, why would I do that? There's a lot of other cool and interesting stuff one could be doing. Now, again, if it's just natural for you and it's a cool exploration, great, go do that. But what I definitely would not want is people coming to me wanting to learn something like that.
Right.
I would just be like, no way.
Right.
Not interesting. Be much more interested in, the entity stuff is classical, of course. It's supported in all the classical texts, but and so there it is, But I'd be more interested in other parts of classical text type liberation and awakening and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
which even those beings want.
Yeah. Well, I'll take your word for it. I'm a bit of a muggle myself in these sorts of realms, but yeah, very fascinating. Okay, well, I imagine after an experience like that, you'd almost have to learn to walk again. Presumably, so much of your responses to your environment and stimulus would be different, maybe not. I'm curious what the integration, so as it's sometimes called, period was like after that. But I'm also curious how it was you came back to the States then and got involved in, speaking of as you've described, magical weirdism, the kundalini yoga tradition.
Basically, based on my own meditation and practices, and I found myself having a lot of energy experiences, some of which were really uncomfortable. And I knew that there were groups that worked with stuff like that, and ran into someone who knew a particular Hindu Tantra guru who was very, very involved with kundalini work. And so I went and basically moved heaven and earth to went through a bunch of difficult circumstances to make sure I met her and started working with her and her guru for many years. And that was a long time ago, and I still know them and still interact with them and love them. So that was how I got involved in kundalini stuff, because they were able to help me work with the energy experiences I was having. And that was much more formal. Speaking of Paka, that's super Paka Tantrism, like very right hand, totally pure Brahminical stuff, So really the absolute opposite of the kind of milieu I was used to, which is like sex and drugs and rock and roll and magic,
Onion juice and underground caves.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a fascinating period. I'm wondering if you're reluctant to name the lineage and the teachers.
Not at all. It's just a very tiny lineage that no one ever has heard of. My direct teacher was Anandi Ma. People think I'm saying Anandamoy Ma, who's ultra famous, but no, I'm just saying Sri Anandi Ma. And her teacher, Dhyan Yogi Sri Madhusudan Dasji, who's no one's ever heard of. But he was a Indian yogi, the kind who ran away from home when he was 13 and was on the road as a wandering sadhu for his entire life. And when I met him, he was well over 100 years old. And they're the kind of people, and it wasn't just me, dozens and dozens and dozens of people, maybe hundreds at this point, could confirm this experience, but they're the kind of people you go in the room with, especially Dhyan Yogi. When I would meet him in India, you just go in the room and you're instantly having some kind of super intense meditation experience or hypervisionary experience or incredibly normal experience that's like tremendously meaningful and captivating and so on. So especially given that I had this kind of experience of, well, there's people who say something's going on, but then, if I do this molecule or I do these things, something really happens. But when I went and worked with them, something was really happening. Hugely transformative experiences very often. And so I was like, wow, they're real. And so I started working with them.
Can you give a sense of the sorts of practices that you were doing? What was the sort of, I suppose, practice methods and so on that you were engaged with at that time with those teachers? And perhaps also a sense of the sorts of experiences you had.
The practices would be very obvious and common, and to anyone who's been involved in Tantrism, either Hindu Tantrism or Vajrayana. So, mantras and chakras and energy and pranayama and yoga postures, lots of recitation of Sanskrit sutras, lots of meditation. I think the most unusual part for a lot of Hindu Tantra was that the meditation was firmly non-dual. We were, you'd use a focus object for just a minute or two and then let go into, space. And it was not that kind of like super focused meditation. but lots of visualization, lots of mantras, lots of chakras, lots of body energy work. And then again, like I say, it had this Brahminical element where, we're doing huge fire ceremonies with hundreds of people and lots of pujas and lots of actual just worship. So a whole kind of what we might call dualistic side as well. And I got trained in all that, so I can, do fire ceremonies. I can lead a fire ceremony, and I can, do Jyotish. Really good at Jyotish, So Hindu astrology, all of which is part of all this stuff. So that's what that tradition is like. I think over the years, it's transformed slightly. I'm not, even though they live nearby and I see them and so on, I'm not super involved in doing any of the traditional practices at this point.
And what were you doing underground and for 30 to 40 days at a time? What was
just
that
what
about?
I just described? That's what you do when you're, in a underground room or in a cave or a basement or whatever you want to call it, doing practices. So we're doing mantras and meditation and pranayama and postures and energy work and a lot of recitation and so on. Very, very, very wonderful stuff. I loved it.
Looking back now, what would you say? You've said before you're able to go into worldviews and take on worldviews and really run with them, but then you eventually you move beyond them, or you not in a derogatory sense. You sort of go. I don't know how to put it exactly. You don't land there permanently, I think you said. So looking back there and coming out of that situation, what do you think? We talked about the essence of your teenage and college insights. What do you think was the essence of what you took out of that situation, or what that situation took out of you?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can reduce it to an essence, but I can talk about some of the stuff. One of the things was being, highly, super into early 80s American Midwestern punk rock world. The whole scene was very, very cynical, very atheist, very skeptical and sarcastic. I was very into super sarcastic skepticism, withering sarcasm, and yet I will say it also still was close enough to the hippie era and Midwestern enough that everyone was still nice to each other. It wasn't like some kind of, beating anybody up or anything like that. It was very, very fun scene, but it was super skeptical and atheist and so on. I would say that working with my Hindu tantra teachers, they wouldn't call it tantra because they think in America that's too associated with sexuality, and they're just not about that at all. So they just call it kundalini meditation, but it's tantrism technically. And so working with those teachers, it really removed like a kind of tough rind from my heart and blasted my heart open, reminded me of just the presence of total love, and really deepened that sense of love. And a lot of it was dualistic. So there's a lot of love of God or various gods, and really, and so, it's very devotional. And so that was quite an antidote to this other side, which was so kind of defended. And so it just melted all that defense away entirely, and then went even deeper and deeper and opened up my heart further than I could have imagined.
Sometimes working with, say, the chakras and the energy body, the energetic channels and so on, is sometimes said to access karmic traces, etc., even traumas, perhaps. I'm curious if, given your background before that point, if you found that to be the case. Did you find the practices had an effect on, say, stored trauma in your body, or epigenetic material, etc., when you're starting to, open the different channels and chakras and so on through those sorts of practices?
I think it had some of that effect, but remember, I had done a lot of psychedelics, including, really pure MDMA, quite a bit, like huge doses that people never do now. And so a tremendous amount of trauma had been healed that way already, honestly. But the energy body work releases so much stuff. And oftentimes that can be a little, as people report, can be a little much. Got to be pretty careful with pranayama and visualization and so on, because it is so powerful. So you can end up, in various uncomfortable states of mind if you're not careful. But yeah, it certainly, in my experience, released traumas and opened up new, like I say, just opened the heart in a way that had not been open before. And introduced me to the joyous, wonderful part of dualistic devotion, and just melting into that over and over, which is kind of, especially in a lot of the areas I work in now, kind of looked down upon. And I'm like, you're also worried about getting out of your mind, and yet you're doing it in this very, very, kind of mental way. What about some beauty? What about some love? What about, devotion? Even if you don't believe in anything, you can still practice devotion. And it's just a wonderful direction. It's really certainly made me permanently kind of, my heart is permanently kind of gushy,
I could imagine that such a orientation would quite radically transform also the way you relate to people, relationships, etc., etc. I'm curious what you noticed there, and also I'm curious about, I'm looking here at my the notes I made for our conversation, and the next name up is Shinzen, right? I'm not sure if we'll get much into that on this occasion.
Shinzen's awesome. That's all I have to say.
Okay, yeah.
He's great.
You've talked about your relationship with Shinzen in many places.
He's such a good guy. Yeah, very, knowing his life and knowing him inside out, that's someone who is very trustworthy.
Yeah. Well, my point was that Shinzen sometimes talks about an awkward intermediary zone when you're going from being closed, but you're not quite open yet. And so you're not shielded against the slings and arrows, but at the same time, you're not so open that they pass through you. And so you of course, know what I'm talking about. Did you experience anything like that? If I get down to it, what I'm trying to say is, how did you calibrate your personal, intimate relationships in particular throughout this period and in general?
Oh, I think I probably fucked most of them up. I mean, it's like the way you're describing it sounds so intentional and careful and stuff, and I'm more like crashing around, blind in the underbrush most of the time. I would say at this point it's more stable. You can ask my wife how much of an asshole I am. And it's like she'll say probably something like, he's not too bad most of the time. I'm not claiming to have some kind of perfect ability to interact with other human beings, but I will say I've always liked other people, and I just like them more. That's the biggest change. I just genuinely like people most of the time. And so no matter how much I mess it up, I I'm not trying to, and I do come back and try to fix it and so on. So that's the best you're going to get from me on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's so fascinating. Thank you, Michael. We're getting close to the end of our time together, but it's been so fascinating. I'd love to have you on again in the future. There's so much we could discuss. In particular, I'd really like to talk about reversing the stack and your particular approach to the non-dual aspect. On your YouTube channel, Michael Taft, it's called on YouTube, you have lots and lots of guided meditations, which are, I think, quite widely and popularly used. And so I'd like to.
I think there's about like almost 200 hours of free guided meditation on there.
Yeah. And one often hears that. One often says, well, I was doing a Michael Taft meditation, and it's a sort of, I think it's become a bit part of the furniture for online spiritual seekers. At least I hear about it all the time. So
of course, that's good news. That makes me happy.
Yeah. So of course I'm going to include links to that YouTube channel, or you can just search Michael Taft, and your website and so on. So I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to talk about your particular way of navigating that non-dual material. I think it's very interesting indeed. And there's some other things. I'd like to talk a bit about your time at Sounds True, touch on that maybe a little, where you were an editorial director for a long time, and you saw all kinds of spiritual teachers coming and going, examining their material, I presume working with them and seeing how the sausage
working with them very closely.
Yeah, I'd like to know some sausage making, stories if you have any interesting ones. And yeah, of course, your relationship with Shinzen, which you give him a lot of credit and speak very highly of him. But I have some questions about that. So anyway, this has been so fascinating. That was my petition for a sequel, Michael. But we'll see.
Oh, of course, anytime.
Oh, splendid.
Sorry, we wasted some time with my internet crapping out at the beginning. So apologies.
Not at all. It's been just so fascinating, and I look forward to the next time. Michael Taft, thank you very much.
Steve, when are we going to get, for the viewers, outside look at your houseboat? It's so fascinating from the inside.
And outside, yes, I could. You're right. That would be interesting.
I want to see a pan video of what your houseboat looks like.
That's not a bad idea. Okay, yeah, I'll think about doing that. Yeah, no problem. Michael Taft, thank you very much.
Thanks, man. Have a great one.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.